My wife and I were sitting in the dining room of an old friend. This was out on the West Coast. And Margaret, the friend, had just finished building a spectacular house with huge windows that overlooked a precipitous, fir-covered slope and distant islands set in blue ocean waters. Somehow the conversation turned to the Great Plains, where Margaret had been born and had lived until her marriage some 40 years earlier. She mentioned that the first time she came west to meet her mother-in-law, the woman told her, in a characteristically no-nonsense way, that the only reason people lived on the plains was that they didn't know better. It's not true, of course. There are plenty of people living on the Great Plains who know better, but who stay put on that grassy apron of the Rockies. Still, Margaret's mother-in-law wasn't really wrong. Most of the people on the plains would indeed leave if they knew where to go and how to survive once they got there. It's a commonplace, except among people staring into cameras or speaking into microphones. We can trace this attitude back to and actually past the 1930s with their archetypal photographs of migrants on Route 66. It's a judgment rooted in the grim history of American Indians. On the southern plains, it's a judgment based on the additional misery of homesteaders coming from mostly poor southern roots and quickly dispossessed of their homesteads and degraded into sharecroppers. Recovering from such abuse is slow, and today, 60 years after the Dust Bowl, supermarkets on the plains still don't have the variety found in markets on the coasts. There's a superabundance of religiosity, at least south of Kansas and its well-tempered Methodists. A recent addition is the cross on the High Plains, just east of Amarillo. 200 feet tall, in its corrugated aluminum majesty, the surreal cross fits nicely with communities where dogs bark all night and where few people think of asking for quiet. Sidewalks are scarce, and the older ones are pretty thoroughly broken up now by tree roots. The trees themselves are dying of old age, and town councils aren't replacing them. Downtowns are dying. Brick blocks abandoned store by store, even the few that, in a last gasp of commercial optimism, were sided with blue aluminum in the duplicitous 1950s. Then there's the physical environment. On the High Plains proper, you can rarely see as far as a mile. The land is simply too flat. Instead, there is an illusion that you're sitting in the center of a shallow plate that has been elevated into the sky. This can feel psychologically uncomfortable, compressing. Most of the Great Plains aren't so flat, and with local relief of 100 feet or so, they offer tremendous vistas from one rolling summit to the next. Still, it's hard for normal human beings to make peace with the wind. It blows unobstructed from the north in winter and from the south in summer. The northern plains have their blizzards, while the southern plains have their famous tornadoes, combined with desiccating summer winds that need only a few seasons to reduce painted surfaces to a sea of flakes. No wonder Margaret came to agree with her mother-in-law and has no interest in the Great Plains any longer. Still, dark clouds and booming thunder outside my Oklahoma window this warm August morning seem to say that I should speak honestly. And in that honesty, I think, lies the greatest virtue and the best defense of the Great Plains. Lightning just flashed outside the window, an approving and vaguely threatening exclamation point. Damned right, it seemed to say. Perhaps honesty may not redeem the plains, but how much I prefer our plainness, barren as it often seems, to the cock-of-the-walk, flavor of the week, opulent, bragging, condescending coasts. What exactly is this honesty? It's certainly not anything people here say or espouse, for in such matters there is as much hypocrisy here as anywhere. Rather, it's in the things people make. Plain things, severe things. These things are icons, windmills, section-line roads, grain elevators. Most of all, the common frame houses that sit by the dozens and hundreds in towns and smaller cities, particularly in the southern plains. Here, houses are smaller, both because winters are shorter and because settlement came later and usually involved people who were close to dirt poor. Such houses can be found outside the southern plains, but the natural simplicity of the plains frames them best, distracts from them least. On the plains these houses speak and are heard. The footprint of the house is an inviolate rectangle. Typically, it might measure 26 by 39 feet. That sounds awfully arbitrary, but those are the measurements of one house that I happen to measure. Perhaps the numbers arise from some multiple of joists or rafters. The house rises from that footprint as a simple box under an equally simple pitched roof, 2 planes, broken only by 2 brick chimneys and plumbing standpipes. The roof as built was of cedar shingles, but 50 plains summers destroy even the best cedar shingles, and today the roof is almost always asbestos shingles, though the cedar may still be there underneath. The walls were originally wrapped in clapboards, sometimes narrow, sometimes broad. Invariably, the walls were painted a puritanical white, a punishing color in bright sun. Today, the paint is almost always flaking unless it's been masked by siding, nurse uniform white. The windows, usually mounted in pairs, are double hung. The upper sash is probably painted stuck, and even the lower one no longer opens easily. The counterweight ropes frayed years ago. Aluminum storm windows have probably been added sometime in the past 20 or 30 years. I think of them and think of nails scratched on a blackboard. The house can sit equally well with the ridge pole either parallel to or perpendicular to the street, but the perpendicular form is probably commoner, perhaps because the house requires less frontage that way. Cost is always a factor. A house like this, land aside, cost about $4,000 in the mid-1930s. Whatever the reason, a passerby usually gets the temple facade minus the columns, unless you count the 2 posts that hold up the front porch. The porch is obligatory. It must be big enough for 2 large chairs, and it has to have at least a couple of steps. It can be mounted along the long wall of the house if that's the way the house sits. Sometimes it's even cut into a corner of the house with the front door recessed in the cutout square. In any case, there shall be a porch. Many a Southern Plains child has been given strict orders never to climb underneath, for fear of rattlesnakes and scorpions and brown recluse spiders. Perhaps the house has 800 or 900 square feet of living space. It's divided into 4 rooms, a living room and kitchen on one side, and 2 bedrooms separated by a bath on the other. The garage is a separate structure. It's the house in miniature, and it's set back at the end of a long driveway. Often as not, nobody parks in it, and it's used for storage. Come into the living room, and you see a hardwood floor, pine in the budget version, oak in the upscale one. The walls are lath and plaster, much cracked, and probably covered now with many layers of paper. Perhaps there's a picture rail, a nice touch. Certainly there are ceiling light fixtures. Still, to modern taste, the room seems small and dark, an effect compounded by the dark wood of the varnished pine doors, and by the window unit air conditioner, which takes up precious window space. There's too much humidity here for evaporative coolers to be effective, at least until you climb onto the high plains. The kitchen has a wood floor too, but it's covered with battleship linoleum. There's an unspoiled wooden countertop, however, and there are solid wooden cupboards and drawers, no formica anywhere in sight. There's a water heater next to the kitchen chimney, which was once connected to a coal stove, now removed. There's an electric or a gas stove now, and somewhere a refrigerator. Where? It's out the kitchen door, where a back porch has been enclosed to make a utility room. There's a washer and dryer out there, too. The other plumbed room, of course, is the bathroom. It has a wood floor covered with linoleum. It has what plumbers call a stool. It also has a wall-mounted sink fitted with 2 separate taps. The tub has a mixing valve, but no shower, and it sits under a single small double-hung window. What else? Not much. There is no basement, only a crawl space entered through a tiny hole in the brick wall of the foundation. Inside is an orchard. 3 rows of short brick piers about 2 feet high. They hold up a central beam, and on either side of it 2 less massive ones, all in parallel and all running the 39 feet of the house's main axis. Wooden wedges have been tapped between the piers and the beams to keep the beams level. Joists, still fragrant after 60 years, have then been laid across the beams, long wall to long wall. The floor of the crawl space is hard dirt with a scattering of old nails. Despite the simplicity of the construction, there's a chaos of pipes, hot, cold, and drain. Up above, the house has an attic, but it's entered with some difficulty through a trap door in a bedroom closet. There's nothing in it, not even floorboards, so to inspect the rafters you must walk carefully, joist to joist. The rafters often protrude outside. Only in the upscale version of the house have carpenters hidden the rafter ends behind soffits. The lot isn't fenced, and very few homeowners pay any attention to the garden. Something grows, nature's that way. But landscaping generally extends to wreaking vengeance on whatever comes up. Real gardening is close to proof that the owner wasn't born here. Now, I am afraid that I am likely to be misunderstood. I want to say that I like these houses, and I fear that people will think that I am being sarcastic. I am not. I don't say that I like scrofulous lawns, or flaking paint, or plastic siding. I don't like the detritus that accumulates inside these houses either. You can see it on display at the garage and estate sales that constitute a regional industry. I despair at the Reader's Digest condensed novels, from whose cumulative mass in this part of the world one could build the pyramids of Giza. I don't like any of this, I say, but I do like the houses. I don't say they're beautiful. I don't say they're works of high craftsmanship. I say only that they're honest, that honesty is a prerequisite to beauty, and that in a cultural landscape wanton in its devotion to falseness, you take what you can get. I say wanton because the American cultural landscape overflows with pretension, which is to say dishonesty. Perhaps a comparison will help. I begin with the houses that Oklahomans began to build after World War II. The ranch house became a national style, of course, rectangular with the long side to the street, framed but always faced in brick, big but always half garage. The claim, in short, was one of stately affluence, but it was only a claim, buttressed by the hypocrisy of looking bigger than you are, more substantial than you are. Even better, think of the houses built today. Here's one, the Cambridge 2 model home, offered by a developer in Norman, Oklahoma. The name Cambridge is wonderful. It has a clear edge over two nearby competitive models, the Kingsbury and the Yorkshire. It's good to know, I think, that there are peerages for sale. After all, the builder's literature carries the name Cambridge in a heavy wedding text font. Isn't that the typeface used on the cover of Debrett's? It's disturbing at first to see on the next page a sketch of two boys fishing from a pier. You see it too, don't you? Straw hats, torn pants cut just below the knee, bare feet, tousled hair. It's Tom Sawyer. The caption reads, "The kind of neighborhood that builds childhood memories." The Cambridge house costs about $190,000. It contains some 3,000 square feet, though several hundred lie in what is here termed a bonus room. I do not know the provenance of bonus rooms, but in this part of the country and in the past 20 years or so, every new house of any pretension has had a Dallas roof, which is to say a great heaped-up windowless attic. Strictly, I suppose, this roof is derived from the old pyramidal roof characteristic of the South, but the Dallas roof is also broken up into as many planes as possible. The Dallas roof might also be called the roofer's revenge, because homeowners must reshingle with alarming frequency. After all, wood shingles are a common subdivision covenant here, expressive of the community's refined tastes. And do you see the bonus room yet? It's the windowless space created in the attic, around whose central portion some wallboard has been thrown up. Women tell me that bonus rooms make wonderful play spaces for children, and I can see it, but I still feel cheated. The stairs up, from the dining room as it happens, have a handrail, balustrade, I mean, that according to the literature is hand-rubbed with walnut stain. I believe we are now in the vicinity of rich budget wood. I can handle that. But I resent being misled, it turns out, to expect something more up those stairs than a windowless shoebox. After all, when we came in, we noticed the beautiful brass carriage light fixtures on either side of the garage door. I'm reading the brochure. And in the living area, we loved the handcrafted oak or ash front door with leaded glass. There's also the dazzling display of natural light from sloped 10-foot ceilings, and the elegant divided light window wall. The quality features just went on and on. Remember the designer kitchen with its wine rack and its many glued-on lengths of pilasters? Even the driveway demonstrated impeccable taste, for the concrete had been molded into genuine simulated cobblestones. We must be ready to talk about financing by now. So, the Southern Plains had come a long way in the past 50 years along that path blazed by the treacherous, culture-commanding coasts. But having acknowledged this triumph of deceit, I want to return to the older houses and to the honesty of the lives lived in them. I'd like you to meet Martha Lucille Searcy, born in 1898 in Wartrace, a hamlet east of Shelbyville, Tennessee, but coming as a young girl with her parents to Elk City, Oklahoma Territory. Lucille was an only child, and perhaps that made it easier for her parents to help her along. Like a surprising number of poor children of that generation, she got to Southwestern State College in Weatherford, Oklahoma, which these days is a bit over an hour's drive west of Oklahoma City. She went on to graduate from the University of Oklahoma at Norman, where in 1930 she received a master's degree in English. I look at her thesis and marvel at the tone of the opening sentence. She writes, "Knowing full the poor psychology of beginning anything with an apology, I yet feel it not beyond the province of a thesis to offer some explanation of a title as possibly vague as Problems in the Text of King Lear." A sentence like this makes me realize that we really have very little idea about the kind of people who settled Oklahoma, and that what we do know or think we know is probably wrong. By 1930, Lucille Searcy had almost certainly met Jean Sugden, another graduate student in the university's English department. Sugden came from a big family in Weatherford, where she had already earned an undergraduate degree. In 1931, she would finish her master's degree at Norman with a thesis on Old English ballads. Lucille Searcy was taken on by the English department as an instructor. In 1936, Jean Sugden was offered a similar appointment. The two women had ambitions, and in 1936 they published a book with Macmillan, Foundation English, went through 15 printings, and did well. Years later, Searcy recalled that the book bought our first Chevrolet. By 1937, with the book out, and with both women appointed to the university staff, Searcy and Sugden felt settled enough to build a house. One of them, I'm not sure which, had inherited a lot with about 75 feet of frontage on Pickett Avenue, which runs north-south in Norman, 5 blocks west of the university. Pickett Avenue at the time was the edge of town. To the west lay Imhoff Creek, a tributary of the Canadian River. Beyond the creek were cotton farms that would stay intact until after World War II. The house Searcy and Sugden built was just the sort I've described. Because the lot was wider than usual, however, and because the house was oriented with the gable toward the street, it sat surrounded by yard, and Searcy and Sugden were a departure from the norm when it came to gardening. They planted an elm on the south side of the front yard to cast summer afternoon shade over the house. They planted 2 sycamores north of the house and on the far side of the driveway to the garage. They planted a sweet gum out back. They planted a sour cherry on the south side of the house. Sweet cherries had not yet been bred to stand the winters here. They fenced the lot with square weave wire, and then planted a heady combination of honeysuckle and dawn roses along the fence line. Closer to the house, they planted pheasant's eye narcissus along the south foundation wall and a large deutzia at the northwest corner. They planted lilacs square in the middle of the backyard and deep purple iris against the garage. Against the back fence, they put in a separately fenced vegetable garden with a chicken coop under the shade of the sweet gum. As for lawn, they relied on the local standby Bermuda grass, which is well suited to the climate, though it goes to straw, both in winter and in dry summers. The driveway remained gravel. There were no underground sprinklers. Circe would later write that our house, a 4-roomed frame house, was built in the spring of 1937, and we moved in June. The two women spent whatever money was needed to keep the house in good shape. Eventually, they decided to quit painting and covered the clapboard with a gloomy gray asbestos siding. But the paint on the clapboard under that siding was still tight. The house was cold, too, because the women refused to install gas, told everybody that they had once been hauled unconscious from a gas-heated house. Instead, they had fiberglass bats stuffed between the floor and ceiling joists, the floor ones neatly kept in place by a screen of chicken wire. They continued to heat with coal. Neat scoops and buckets were kept next to the 2 cast-iron stoves, but eventually they installed electric baseboard heating. Despite their book, Circe and Sugden remained instructors, and their teaching loads were heavy, with 4 courses each term. The university class schedule for the fall of 1939 shows both of them with 14 hours of class a week. Both women taught a section of grammar and composition, 2 sections of the first semester of Principles of English Composition, and 1 section of either English usage or the second semester of the Principles course. It seems clear that they were teaching the courses that the professors didn't want to teach. It must have been with some bitterness that both women resigned in 1944 to take positions as teachers at Norman High School. Sugden switched to mathematics, but Circe stayed with English. Both women continued on at Norman High until their retirements in 1968. They never married and they never moved. McKinley Elementary School stood and still stands half a block north of their house, and a neighbor told me a few years ago that when he was a boy, Circe and Sugden always had him come over after school for cookies and tutoring. The place always smelled of baking, he said. Other neighbors remember the two women, especially Circe, as crotchety and fiercely independent. She would poison stray cats, these people recall. Once, it seems, she shot a paper boy with buckshot. There was family trouble, too. One of Sugden's sisters later wrote that none of the Sugdens had been permitted to have a close relationship with Jean for several years. The hostility must have run deep, for the two women eventually drew up matching wills in which their combined estate was willed to a nephew of Sugden's. The will was changed in 1980, and the nephew was given nothing. Instead, everything went to the McFarland Methodist Church in Norman. The estate, which eventually amounted to about $130,000, split evenly between the house and other assets, came with instructions that it was to be used for University of Oklahoma scholarships. In retirement during the 1970s, Circe developed severe arthritis. Sugden was incapacitated with Parkinson's disease. Circe nursed her, writing to a friend, "I spend more hours on my feet and on duty than I did when I was in my 20s and teaching 100 students a day." Eventually it became too much, and Sugden was taken to Rosewood Manor Living Center. I wonder what a time the two women might have had with that name. Circe stayed behind in the house, alone. In a letter to a friend, she wrote, "I did not choose growing old in this fashion." She seems to have feared senility, though people who knew her say she was fine. Perhaps she was angry at the thought of being humored. Quote, "I think people meet senility as they must," she insisted, "not as they would like to." Certainly she remained as difficult as ever. Quote, "Truly, there were always 2 sides to a quarrel," she wrote to a neighbor who had stormed out, slamming the door and determined never to help her again. "And you did try to boss me terribly. My time is short, my strength so scant." Another neighbor, also a retired schoolteacher, recalls going to the store for Circe on August 15th, 1982. That was the day Circe died. Right there in the front bedroom, the woman told me. Lucille Circe was buried next to her parents in the Roselawn Cemetery in Elk City. You can go out there now and see the parents' shared stone. Next to it, laid flat in the turf, is a small rose granite slab that says only Martha Lucille Circe, 1898 to 1982. Next to it, a perfect twin, is a stone that reads Jean Louise Sugden, 1903 to 1983. The Circe and Sugden house stood empty for 2 years after Circe's death. Then, in May 1984, after the estates of both women had been probated, the house was sold. It went in a flash, with the realtor getting an offer the same day his sign went up. There was an estate sale. The newspaper ad promised over 40 years of accumulation and listed 8 rocking chairs, a pie safe, oak library tables, and cedar chests. There were handmade quilts and plenty of hand-sewn clothes, too, none of the fabric synthetic. The old coal stoves were there and garden tools. The new owners, who were from the Pacific Northwest, bought as much as they could. The rest flew away. Then, over the next few years, the new owners stripped the flowered wallpaper and sanded the floors, all the floors, even the ones that had been covered with linoleum. The old water heater and refrigerator and stove stayed. Why not? They had lasted for 30 years, would last for another 30, and had a degree of character. The garage became a studio, complete with a skylight. Nothing could be done with the asbestos tile siding, not unless the owners wanted to replace it or go back to painting. But the house was brightened by painting the eaves and window frames a color like brick. A few people around town picked up the hint and adopted the same color, which comes close to matching the Permian sandstone that underlies this part of Oklahoma. The new owners worked hard in the garden, leaving the trees but adding thickets of flowers, and gradually replacing the Bermuda grass with lush, if thirsty, fescue. Perhaps it was a foolish choice, but there was now too much shade for Bermuda. So there it is, Lucille Circe in her house, unprepossessing, militantly plain, modest, competent, without affectation. 2 lessons, one in the flesh, the other in a house, and both saying that life is lived as it must be. Compare that with a store I saw on the West Coast. A neon sign over the doorway said, "Enter the excitement." The hard part in all this is that the honesty of the Southern Plains expresses a truth that we may not want to hear. I go out along the abandoned stretches of old US 66, see the square blocks of concrete with tar expansion joints, and recall those old black and white photographs of men and women leaning against old loaded-down cars. I can show you places in the Southern Plains today that have a grimness to match those photos. Sometime when you're passing through, I'll show you Bridgeport. The engineers who designed Interstate 40 didn't give it a sign. Still, we'll take the exit 99 off-ramp and head to the water tower a mile to the north. That's Bridgeport's only landmark. It was erected, as the builder's plate says, by the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company in 1903. Once there was a bridge across the Canadian River here, hence the town and its name. But US 66 bypassed Bridgeport, so did Interstate 40. Now there's nothing left except maybe 50 houses, occupied but in disrepair. Bridgeport has no commercial establishments, no post office, not even a bridge, just that water tower as a reminder of ambition defeated. Or I run a few miles south to Anadarko. You recall the government's belief that the best way to help Oklahoma's Indians was to assimilate them, and that the best way to assimilate them was to take their reservations, cut them up into homestead-sized parcels, allot those parcels to tribal members, and then open the rest of the reservations to settlement by whites. The Cheyenne and Arapaho near Bridgeport, like the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache just to their south, weren't interested in farming, so they leased their allotments to whites and after a while quit even living on the land. Many went to Anadarko, which became and remains a ghetto. Drive through Anadarko and you'll see that the local theater is named the Redskin. Yes, indeed. And its marquee has a war bonnet in 1950s style neon. Go a mile north of town to see the regional headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You'll have to hunt, even though the building is big enough to house the Strategic Air Command. It's all one story, with massive prefabricated concrete walls, tiny slit windows like loopholes, and not a sign on the place. Sure, there is a nearby concrete wall with the lonely letters BIA, but they sit there looking as though they hope nobody sees them. You can understand, of course, why the BIA lies low. I once visited the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Indian children didn't volunteer to go there, of course. They were rounded up. There's a cemetery on the base. It has tombstones labeled with every Indian tribe you can think of. And there's a fine old building that makes nice barracks for officers today, but which was once the girls' dormitory. Down along Cache Creek, south of Lawton, Oklahoma, there's an old man living in an original allotment house with walls covered with photographs of his ancestors dressed in buckskin and feathers. He has an old war bow, and he knows stories about places like Rainy Mountain and the great Medicine Bluff Cliffs on the grounds of Fort Sill near Lawton. You can see the cliffs yourself if you're interested. The Fort Sill authorities are proud of their ecology program, but you can't climb the cliffs. They're off limits. A while ago, I was talking with a successful third-generation wheat farmer who lives a few miles north of Bridgeport. Mike's about 50, tall, husky, with more of a gut than he probably likes. He drives a big diesel Suburban, and no doubt he could buy me 6 times over. He's got a sense of humor that sneaks up on you except when he's talking about taxes. Mike owns about 2,000 acres, mostly upland, but some North Canadian bottomland. On it, he grows about 1,600 acres of wheat, which he sells, and a few hundred acres of alfalfa, which he sells or feeds to a couple of hundred head of cattle he owns. His grandfather, Jacob, came from Ohio in 1900 and settled on the same 80 acres on which Mike's house and farm buildings stand. For that land, Jacob paid $6,000, an astronomical price at the time, but the land was good and the years were optimistic. Jacob survived World War I, though he came out of it with a new, non-Germanic name. He didn't fare so well in the Depression, and he quit farming in the early 1930s, sold the place to his son, Clarence, and moved, for good, to McAllen, Texas. Clarence hung on, and eventually he thrived. In 1933, he had the brains to build a 30,000-bushel grain storehouse in which he could hold a crop when prices were bad. His real opportunity came after World War II. Clarence's neighbors began to disappear one by one, while he bought their land and expanded his holdings to about 1,000 acres. In 1948, Clarence built a new house. Nothing fancy. It's Mike's place today. And he got rid of Jacob's house, which was sold, cut down, put on a truck, and hauled to the nearby town of Geary. It's still occupied there. Clarence sold the farm to Mike in the late 1960s, and Clarence then followed his father, Jacob, to retirement in McAllen. Since then, Clarence has come up now and then to visit. Mike has meanwhile doubled his father's on-farm grain store. I asked him about mice in the original structure, which was made of wood. Mike smiled and said he had cats. Mike's own secret for success is that he not only stores his grain but bypasses the local grain merchants and trucks his crop all the way down to the Gulf. Surely, I said, the transportation cost killed him. Nope, he replied. Trucking his grain cost him 55 cents a bushel, 7 cents more than shipping by rail, and the advantages of timely sale more than compensated for that extra cost. Mike was a gambler, and he admitted it. When I saw him, wheat was selling for over $5 a bushel, the highest price in years, yet he had 30,000 bushels of last year's crop still in storage. Why? Well, he said, with a quiet smile, he was betting that prices would go still higher. People told him he was crazy, but that's what he was going to do. No, he said in answer to the next question, he didn't hedge his crop in the futures market. He preferred out-and-out gambling. When I saw him, he was excited by a new toy, a Cat Challenger, a 325-horsepower diesel crawler with rubber treads. With it, he said, he could pull a 30-foot drill and plant 20 acres of wheat in 1 hour. A good investment? Absolutely, he said. His crop this April was green, while many of his neighbors had no crop at all. Back in the fall, he explained, there had been a foot of rain in one brief period. He had gone out and planted right on top of it. Since then, there had been almost nothing, and the seed planted by his neighbors, who didn't get their seed in the ground that fast, had never germinated. By most standards, mine included, this is a success story. But what about Mike's own father and grandfather? Why had they left Oklahoma? Why had Jacob never returned even to visit? Meanwhile, Mike's own son, Randall, wanted to take over. There didn't seem to be any question about it, even though Mike acknowledged that the trend to bigger farms shows no signs of abating. Why shouldn't farms get bigger? Mike and Randall alone do almost everything on their 2,000 acres, and Randall rents and farms another 800 on his own. Even at harvest, the busiest time of the year, the two men hire only 2 extra hands. How then, I ask myself, can the family be sure that it will do the swallowing and not be one of the swallowed? Somebody's sure got to be swallowed as the engine of agribusiness rolls on. The wind was blowing hard from the south as Mike talked, and the soil of one unlucky neighbor was blowing past in clouds. It was funny, Mike said, the way the wind blew here. Just the other day, the dust had been coming from the north. Isn't it so with us, too? Blown this way and that, anchored for a while and then drifting. Isn't that Lucille Searcy's story and the story of the allotment Indians? Isn't it the story of farmers and everybody else? And where, I ask, can you learn this lesson as well as you can here on the Great Plains?